Welcome to another episode of Talk Time with MaxContact. I'm your host, Sean McIver. In today's episode of Talk Time with MaxContact, I am delighted to welcome Steve Sullivan, a distinguished freelance consultant and interim manager specializing in Omni Channel customer experience and management. With over 20 years of successful delivery in both client and supplier roles, Steve has a wealth of knowledge in optimizing customer engagement and leveraging compliance for competitive advantage. He's seen it from both sides of the coin. He's also the founder of Channel Doctors and has been instrumental in guiding organizations through the complexities of GDPR and data protection. Welcome, Steve. I always like to do the introduction quite briefly. Is there anything key I've missed out there that you would like to add?
No, sure. That was amazing. He sounds like a great guy. I'd love to hear loads from that guy. He sounds amazing.
Awesome. So let's just get stuck in. I'm going to jump straight into it. Obviously, over the last 5 years now, the entire contact center industry and business at large has been through a wild ride. What recent innovations in the contact center space, specifically around performance management, have you found most impactful, and how have they changed the way contact centers operate?
Oh, well, you're right. Yeah, I mean, the whole world has changed so much, hasn't it? And I do remember going for a walk in that weird first week or two of the COVID lockdown when people who had proper jobs, unlike me, did incredible work and did things that would have taken 3 or 5 years, and they'd got their whole workforce to work from home, and it was amazing. And I remember talking to somebody who was saying that various people were claiming, well, actually, everything's working just as well as it did remotely as it did when we're in the office, and we're just managing our people, and we've got morale, and everything's working just as well as it always did. And I remember saying, well, if it doesn't make any difference to how you manage your people and get performance, if your whole workforce has gone home for the first time, then you weren't doing it very well when people are in offices. And I think the impact of that is still being felt. Not necessarily that every contact center was an exemplar of how to motivate and get the best out of people and get the best performance in terms of value rather than just beating people with a stick. They weren't all that great at that, but they had some of the basics in place. And I think some of those basics have maybe fallen aside with the combination of hybrid and home working. But there's been other challenges as well, which is the whole great resignation, quiet quitting surge, almost kind of brought a lot of things home to roost for contact centers. For years, even though people probably like ourselves have really waved the flag for contact centers and what they can be at their best, for most people, a contact center is never mind. Well, it's a start. It's something. You can do that while you look for something you really want to do. It's one of those sort of jobs. And again, this is not news to anybody who understands contact centers, as the nature of the demand you have to deal with, the complexity, the emotion you get from customers. And again, that's something that's become a real challenge over the last 3 or 4 years. I've not spoken to anybody on the front line who doesn't say people are getting more challenging, more irascible, more impatient. As that becomes a bigger challenge, people have reached a point in their lives when, for whatever reason, because of the impact of COVID or whatever, go, I'm not sure I really want to be doing this. Then those two things crash together. And that's a real challenge if you're trying to run a contact center, which they tend to be flooded with performance metrics, output metrics, in an environment where it's quite hard sometimes to get the best out of people or allow people to bring their best selves to work. So I see people working really hard to almost make quality delivery possible when those functional things happened all of a sudden 3 or 4 years ago. And then we've got the whole impact of technology as well, which is another raft of issues and challenges that come from that as well, I think.
Do you think that that's been the result of maybe a confluence of these things coming together, as well as some of the things that happened across that time period that we discussed? I mean, one of the things that I find really interesting is what you talked around customer expectation. We talk a lot about customer experience and ensuring that customer experience is where it needs to be. How do you measure customer experience if the customer expectation itself is this dynamic shifting entity? Is there a way to measure customer expectation and the gulf between customer experience and customer expectation?
And it's really interesting you bring that point up. Maybe that's almost like sometimes the missing element that, I guess, if you think there's 3 key ways which we tend to measure or give ourselves a guide as to how we're doing in terms of the fundamentals of the job. There's Net Promoter Score, we could talk for the next 45 minutes about that. A great concept. Not sure it's that applicable necessarily to a lot of what goes on in contact centers. CSAT, customer satisfaction, ask the customer what their experience was. 9 times out of 10, the customer doesn't want to tell you because they've now moved on. They've solved their problem, hopefully. Customer effort score. I like customer effort score because it's something about, most people deep down don't want to be talking to our contact center people. Customer effort score is a great indicator of how difficult it's been to get to that point, which might also give you the clue as to why people get wound up and people are irascible and can't give a clear explanation of how they got to that point. But I think expectation is so important. I'm lucky enough to do some work with a friend of mine, Mark Malloy, who's a behavioral economist, and it sort of takes me out, not wholly, takes me out of my contact center bubble, and it deals with questions like, why do these people keep contacting us? Why do customers keep contacting us? Why don't customers follow the happy path? Why does this happen? There's no logical reason why people are doing this. And you actually genuinely look at things from the customer's point of view, which is actually quite hard. It takes a real shift. Is then often about expectation and, people's expectations. And of course, we subconsciously drive people's expectations. So we did loads of work with a high street bank in the Republic of Ireland. And we just felt we were constantly having a discussion going, why do people keep calling us? Because you keep telling them to call you, either explicitly or subliminally in these incredibly complicated websites and digital journeys that you can imagine a high street bank with all those product types, all those segments are constantly saying, well, if this is tricky, just give us a call. That's the safety valve. That's the default. Expectation, really important. And actually really quite hard to get your head around. And I think related to that as well is, what do people expect from different organizations? For some organizations, I'd say most of us, and I'm not the youngest person who's going to listen to this podcast, I probably have an old-fashioned view of the public sector. I probably think the public sector is not that digitally adept, and that's probably an inaccurate view. But I would default think public sector is probably going to be a bit slow, probably be a bit clunky, lots of asynchronous comms. Financial services, well, if I've got Monzo. If I'm dealing with Monzo, I'd expect that to be quite slick, seamless, effortless. If I'm talking to Santander, which is my business bank, I expect that to be a lot more clunky, and it generally is. It's that curse of legacy, isn't it? And I think we have to kind of balance what the customer expects versus what we expect the customer to expect. Customers often don't understand our proposition. I remember years ago doing some work with a TV firm, a streaming firm, talking to their trainers, who were incredulous when halfway through this assignment, I said, no, I've got an account. And they said, but you know how it works then? I was going, not really. But you understand the proposition? No, not really. I just was told by one of my kids to sign up and I'm still paying the monthly fee for this service. But I didn't know really how it differentiates itself. I didn't really know how to manage it. Why would I? I've got loads of log-on accounts, and there was it wasn't that important to me. To those guys, incredibly important because it was their job.
I think you touch on something really important there as well. And you mentioned around specifically different organizations which will inevitably have different customer expectations. And also for want of a better phrase, the degree with which the customer is invested in whatever they're trying to achieve. For example, if I'm trying to book a holiday, my expectations are wildly different than if, God forbid, I'm contacting a funeral directors. And my customer experience expectations there are very, very different. You've worked with a wide array of different businesses in terms of their market segment, for want of a better phrase. Have you found that to be the case? And I guess on the back of that, I would add that there's a lot of conversations around creating a customer-centric culture and how important that is for a successful contact center. I guess those two things kind of can easily become loggerheads if there's an incongruity between the culture and the customer centricity versus the customer experience or the customer expectation, depending on your market segment. I appreciate that was quite a rambling question, but I wonder if you've got thoughts on that particular area.
I suppose in an ideal world, you're right, that there would be total congruence and every organization would understand its proposition, its sector, the emotional mindset that typically a customer would come to them at different points in our customer journey. But I don't think they do. I mean, I remember years ago, this may or may not be a good example, having a great few months working on the sort of strategy and design for a multilingual contact center that would cover all of Asia Pac for a big, very successful luxury clothing brand. And yeah, we got as far as negotiations with outsourced providers, with twin hubs to cover the various different language requirements, and done so much work on this. And the whole thing died a death almost overnight. And I was kind of blinking, going, oh, where have my clients gone? And it transpired that back in Europe, where there was a contact center, there was a 70,000 ticket backlog of 70,000 very disappointed customers who'd spent an awful lot of money for things that didn't turned up broken, whatever. And, in retrospect, it was obvious if you had the big picture, you'd realize you probably need to fix the basics first. And that was a very premium, a very expensive price point organization that wasn't delivering great service. But I don't think it's particularly suffered as a result, because the brand is more powerful than the service. Whereas in the world of, I don't know, domestic gas and electric, service is probably a lot more important when you need it. I couldn't tell you hand on heart what the customer service is like from my gas and electric provider, because I've not really asked them to do very much for me. And if I did, it's probably really critical. Either the billing's totally awry or I'm suffering financially. Then I really need a high standard of responsive service from those people. Actually, if I'm in love with a brand and it's a luxury, it's an optional choice, it's less of an issue. I'm a bit out of my league, but somebody told me that, if you want a Rolex, and having worked for a different luxury goods firm that owns various watchmakers and so on, they reckon Rolex isn't all that. It's quite a generic mechanism, they like mine, when you spend £7,000 on your Rolex. But Rolex have certain watches that you have to be on the waiting list for. That is part of the proposition. You have to put your name down and you have to wait. And I think maybe like Ferrari are like this as well. There's certain cars you can only buy if you already own one or two Ferraris. You're not even going to get on the waiting list until you've proven your creds as a customer. This is very different to providing Steve Sullivan's car insurance or gas and electric. So it doesn't necessarily, what I'm saying is it's not a straight continuum. It doesn't matter what the service is. High value, you have to deliver exemplary service. Not really true, I don't think. It's a lot more nuanced and complicated than that.
I'm going to jump in and just yes and you on that one, because I think that's a really key point. I think an item can still be low value but high importance on a personal level. The example you gave, talking to an energy supplier, if you have an energy issue whereby either you got a gas leak or your boiler's not working or your electricity's not working, the urgency and the importance that you put on getting that handled with effectively, and the way in which the person you speak to responds to your concerns is wildly different than, an expectation with, for example, a luxury good. And I think that's a really effective way of positioning that. I guess off the back of that, you've got quite an extensive experience in outsourcing overall relationship management. And I guess there's a tangential connection here around what we've been talking around in terms of customer expectation, customer experience, that ties to the channel that you choose to communicate with someone on, and the way in which I behave as a customer. For example, if I contact someone via web chat, my expectations are different than if I'm actually talking to somebody physically, either in person or on the phone. How do you manage that? What factors should good organizations consider when selecting and managing their, for example, outsourced service providers, to make sure that those various factors are taken into account?
I guess if you take it almost up a level to that whole decision about, should we outsource? Is outsourcing appropriate for us? I think you probably need a clear view as a buyer as to why you're outsourcing. But I don't think that there's a right or wrong answer. I mean, I did some work with my sort of friend and collaborator, Neris Caulfield, a year or two ago, and we met a real premium client, very sort of glitzy name, and they'd outsourced, and the outsourcer was doing a great job. No criticism of the outsourcer at all, but it was almost as if the client wasn't expecting any more from the outsourcer, which was quite surprising. And when you delve deeper, you realise because they had incredibly seasonal business, and by using an outsourcer, they no longer had to recruit more than 100 people in a very high wage, competitive employment market for a short period of time to train them on a whole series of very complicated processes as you got towards Christmas, with that customer rage increasing day by day. And it was an horrendous experience that took up, 6 or 9 months worth of emotional energy for that organization. They outsourced. As I say, they did no criticism of the outsourcer at all, but the outsourcer was just doing pretty vanilla stuff. But they took the pain away, which then allowed the clients, I think, to really think about what did they want to deliver? How did they evince that tone of voice across multiple channels? So, whereas other people are outsourcing for different reasons, I think I don't know, if you're building your £1 billion unicorn and you've got very little funding and a short period of time to prove yourself, customer service probably isn't that important to you, really. I mean, if you've got a very small team of people, it probably does make sense for you to outsource. And conversely, if you're a very large and established organization, you just might see there are benefits in outsourcing. So, I mean, I'm old enough to remember a long time ago, maybe 20 years ago, I worked for a big global BPO. Even then it was a global BPO. What was in effect Siebel. You're probably too young to remember what Siebel is. Siebel was the Salesforce of its day. And spent an awful lot of money to essentially sell Siebel to the clients. And as time has gone on and as technology has become much more accessible and the barriers to accessibility to tech have dropped, then a lot of those BPOs, maybe 10, 15 years ago, realized their real USP was being able to recruit, retain, motivate people and understanding processes, weaving together processes. And that was their real strength. And now, or in certainly the last 24 months, they've realized being solely in the people game isn't a great place to be. Apparently, we won't need any people in a couple of years' time. Well, we all know we will, but we'll need far fewer people. And that creates a different set of challenges. So somebody was telling me they were talking to one of the big global BPOs and they said, which employs nigh on 500,000 people with headsets, to give some context globally, said, "Oh no, we're not a outsourcing firm. We're really a technology firm." You're really not. But it might be, as a client, I go, look, I know you're not really a technology firm, but I know you know an awful lot about the application of technology in a consumer-facing world. And actually, I've got enough on. My pace of change, the expectation, demands from my leadership team are so great. You just look after my customer base. It's not that I don't care, and it might be that somebody who outsources has a really good view of A, what they want to deliver, or B, those questions they need to answer. On social, everybody loves the little Aldi M&S scraps and the Yorkshire tea cheekiness. But can you maintain that cheekiness if you're dealing with a demographic whose first point of call is social, but actually have got something really serious to talk about? And they don't want bounce on social just because it's social. In the same way that, and in some way you might say, phone, voice, is for an older demographic, therefore you need to be more formal. Well, do you? Maybe you need to be more human, because it's often the point in which people have given up. They've stepped off that carefully organized brown paper diagram you had in your war room 12 months ago. They've become an edge case. They just want somebody to talk to. They just want somebody to show some empathy. So I think it's a real challenge, and there's no simple answer, I don't think, as to how you deliver these things. But starting to think about it is a great start, addressing the challenge.
Yeah, you've touched on some really key points there, and I will absolutely cycle back to at least one of those in just a moment. But for now, I want to continue down this conversation that we've established and just go down the garden path a little bit further with this. Because I also know that in your work with Channel Doctors, you help companies navigate customer data management. And in some cases, that's under very strict regulations. I mean, I guess from that point of view as well, there are key elements of that have to inform those decision-making processes. What are some of the best practices or quote-unquote best practices that you would recommend for compliance with the need for effective customer engagement?
Well, I suppose if you take it back a few years to when sort of GDPR hit, if that's the word, I don't think GDPR really hit many people at all, but the perception was it was going to hit people. So certain things that organizations did, like, I mean, probably more even in the B2B world than B2C, is in a panicked way, they probably didn't need to, ditching their prospect database. It's probably actually helped an awful lot of people. And it's kind of got away from that traditional old direct marketing, throw 1,000 mail shots, emails, whatever it is. If you get one or two reactions, well, that's a success. Slightly shifted people away from that mindset, which is probably a bit of an accelerator towards the more digital and hopefully more personalized world we're in now. That's one thing that happened some time ago. I think beyond that, unfortunately, a lot of these challenges come down to big solutions, complex solutions, which is for 25 years, people have wanted a single view of the customer. And every time people almost get close to having a single view of the customer, a new proposition or channel demand or delivery point appears, and then it becomes a fragmented view of the customer. But everybody's got a good reason for a single view of the customer. And it might appear on the surface, well, how do you square that with minimizing data? So, I mean, the best way, I guess, to be compliant, given that your biggest risk in compliance is, in the world of data, is a breach. Even if you don't get told off or fined, there's massive reputational damage. There's an awful lot of hard work and grief and heartache if you have a breach. And breaches escalate all the time. I can't keep up with data breaches, partly because people are being more honest about it, but also because they're so prevalent. The best way to minimize the impact of a breach is to minimize the data you hold, which might sound like that doesn't square with how do you create a single view, but the only way you create a single view is bringing that data together. And mostly you don't need 5-year-old call recordings. Like, you know what somebody's experience was and what those key contact points were. And if, for instance, you can accurately summarize what that contact point was. So, for instance, as we all know now, if you can auto summarize, so a useful use of AI, 50% of the internal focus on an agent is you didn't properly capture what the nature of that call was. Well, the nature of that call was 3 different things and an underlying emotional element, which wasn't one of those 3 things, which is a separate thing which I can't code and capture. If you get it done for you and that data is available in a format that can be interrogated, so you can actually view that almost like a longitudinal view of what somebody's experiencing, as opposed to there was this thing, then that thing, then that thing, which is very hard to get. That's not creating a single view. That's creating a sort of points view. Which all sounds great, but it means investment, it means time, and it means managing your data. And there's probably not quite as many erroneous, misbehaving bots stories as there are data breach stories, but it's a closer run thing now. And nearly every time there's a story about erroneous bot, there's the Air Canada case, there's a recent case of McDonald's, which admittedly is not really contact center, it's actually in-store or drive-in ordering in the States. It's almost all down to not managing the data properly. So you need to manage your data properly to be secure or to be more compliant. But actually, you need to do that anyway if you're going to exploit the new technologies. It's a big job, not one I'm qualified really to deliver. Just sit on the sidelines.
Data's one of those things whereby everyone agrees, yes, you need to have the data, you need to unlock your data, you need to be empowered by what your data is telling you, and I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with that. But I also think that quite a lot of time, or quite often, what we find is there's a parallel between data and process, where people believe that they understand their processes, but when you actually interrogate people about their processes, they start to get very fuzzy very quickly, particularly with more complex processes. And the same would apply to data. If you've got complex data, how well can you understand and kind of not control, but manipulate that data to extract information from it, and also therefore ensure its security? There's a second part of this that we haven't touched on, and you mentioned GDPR. I'm going to put to you, we haven't talked around consumer duty. And I wonder if consumer duty is kind of GDPR 2.0, and we're already starting to see some headlines coming off the back of consumer duty. What's your take there?
I suppose generically, and it's not a relentless progression, but pretty much if you want to know if you're not in a regulated industry, how you'll need to be treating your customers in 5 years' time, look to the regulated industries, or at least what the expectations are in the regulated industries. The delivery might be different. So we talked about utilities and gas and electric. I don't think their record of achievement over the last 2 or 3 years, with wait times doubling and all the rest of it, is very positive, but what the regulator wants to achieve. So in things like vulnerability, it's the regulated industries have been way ahead of anybody else. And now a recognition of vulnerability, it seems to be almost totally widespread across the contact center world, if indeed there is such thing as a contact center world. So I think consumer duty is really interesting. And I guess 2/3 of consumer duty, in an iceberg type sense, I don't really understand this about product design. And yeah, that absolutely makes sense. If you design your products right in the first place, you're probably going to solve a lot of your problems in flight through the sort of customer life cycle. But the things you need to do or are required to do for customers are really demanding. So it's around, not just doing the right thing or treating your customer fairly. It's also being confident that you can understand what your customers' needs are, to almost know what they want and to ensure that you're not going to exploit that need, inadvertently abuse that need, almost in real time. And that's really difficult. And again, I think that the challenge there, and the challenge that financial services firms will face, is how do you do this without just it being more and more and more cognitive load for the advisors? I mean, I wrote something about 18 months ago on the back of some data about the number of applications the average contact center advisor has to use. This is just unimaginable. So, in the old days, the boss would say, I'd never ask my people to do anything I couldn't do. Well, I don't think I've met a senior leader who could, for 5 minutes, do what their people on the front line do. It's just too much. And I mean, it depends what your brain's like. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't hold that amount of stuff in my head whilst being empathetic, understanding and adept in how I interact with somebody. I can't talk and write at the same time. That's too much of a challenge for me. And there was my little tangent, I could go off on here. HSBC got fined, since I think late May, about £6 million by the FCA for essentially letting down customers, all customers who were using debt products. So it was mortgages, credit cards, loans, the usual sort of thing. In the UK, it's a bit of a convoluted story, but a lot of what went wrong, and there was a £6 million fine, but there's been something like £150 million in remediation costs, and HSBC claim, they might be kitchen sinking a bit, over £100 million in terms of internal project costs. So somebody did well out of that. And this is historic, this is going back a few years, but it's only come to light recently, to allow them to treat customers the way they should be treated, treat them properly. A lot of the processes and procedures that failed were all down to advisors in conversation with somebody, recognizing that they were exposed or vulnerable, or perhaps they didn't have the right product for their needs, or there were certain measures that should be put in place for that individual that they had to recognize, work out whether it's appropriate according to their sort of matrix, and apply. And then, of course, that's where some of the data fell apart, because not all those systems spoke to each other. But the main point of failure day to day was sat with the frontline agents. And they had recruitment difficulties. It was hard to train. A lot of these things people picked up through experience, which is no good if you're talking to the inexperienced agent. So consumer duty sounds great and is very positive. How you deliver it is a real challenge. And I think probably what a lot of people, if we've got people watching this, are in financial services contact centres, they're probably knee deep in it. And it's not just writing their mandatory reports that they have to now do and present to the board to prove that they're doing the right things. It's actually doing the right things. But this will be, I think, will become everybody's problem further on down the line. So it'll be interesting to see how it develops.
I think you're right. It is most definitely an evolving landscape. And I think that Again, we saw this previously with GDPR, whereby it was brought in and everyone did something, and it wasn't until, again, from my memory of it, it wasn't until someone was actually held to account against those rules that then there was a reaction off the back of that. And I suspect that there'll be something similar with Consumer Duty. People have read Consumer Duty, they've kind of implemented something. But I think as we start to see more of this regulatory reaction and the response to that, there'll be more of a comprehensive understanding of what that means in real terms in implementing it. I've got time for one more question, and I'm going to close it off with the topic that everyone talks about and we can't get through a conversation without discussing. You've already mentioned it a couple of times, and that's AI. The world of compliance and the world of artificial intelligence, and I'm going to use these small worlds, it feels like they are on an inevitable collision course. We see some of the stories that are happening around some of the big players in AI. We see some of these stories that are happening around the space of compliance. Am I wrong? Would you disagree? What's your take on the future of AI and the intersection of compliance there? How do we do that?
You're not wrong, and I guess there's so much about AI that is beyond most of our understanding, and it's interesting to talk about something that almost at the start you accept you don't quite understand it. And I've been working with somebody who's, I think, does understand the world of AI and lots of work with IBM, and I'm struggling to keep up. There is definitely a compliance. It's not a threat. I mean, it's a good thing. I would have thought most of us would think we need compliance, and it's interesting to see how different jurisdictions are coping with it. So the previous government, there was a private members bill going through the Lords where somebody was seeking to specifically regulate AI. That obviously fell by the wayside and was probably never going to become law anyway. The government had consciously decided they wouldn't seek to regulate AI. As we know, the EU has had a different approach, and that law's just been published. It won't take effect till 25, 26, and I need to really get my head around what does that mean in real terms. But there is regulation, and I think the UK approach is probably quite pragmatic, which is, well, there are rules out there anyway. So a lot, as you say, a lot of the GDPR stuff would apply to AI. If I'm putting my cynical hat on, did anybody who created large language models, did they give a second thought to any kind of data privacy when they did their training data? I very much doubt it. Let's put it that way. Don't sue me. So I think there's a bit of retrofitting of respecting of personal data. That genie's kind of come out of the bottle, and now people are trying to put it back in. But we know it's a challenge. So I just read literally today, there's been a complaint in the US gone to the SEC saying that OpenAI had NDAs on all their employment contracts, and then who left the company wasn't allowed to whistleblow. That's really concerning stuff. And if you look at the EU AI Act, which is probably the nearest thing we're going to get to a GDPR-like standard, a lot of it is around transparency, which again is quite GDPR-like. So if you looked at GDPR, I would say if you're going to sort of profile and segment your customers, you have to be able to know what you're doing and explain how it works. That was probably difficult enough for most organizations 5 or 6 years ago. I think that's a real big challenge now. I mean, speaking personally, I microwaved some soup earlier on. I don't know how that microwave works. I have not got a clue. I've got a smartphone. I don't really understand how that works. I don't really understand how airplanes stay in the sky, to be honest. Really. I know they do, mostly. But trying to explain how your application of Gen AI, how it works and the decisions it makes, it's a really high bar. And I think that's really going to be really interesting because, in brief, my sort of take on compliance for, if you like, customer-facing people like us, is it's a triangle. So everybody thinks about the regulator who sits at the top, but 99 times out of 100, the regulator doesn't know who you are and doesn't care what you're doing. And certainly the UK is mostly focused on scammers, and I'm sure you have no scammers listening to your podcast. The other two key agents, if you like, are your customers and your stakeholders. And most customers, most of the time, are blithely uninterested in data privacy until they really are interested in data privacy. And they're unnerved by what you know or what the tools you use or the suppliers you use know about them. So that's a real wild card. And there's your stakeholders. So again, if you want to understand a new piece of regulation, generally your best people to talk to is an outsourced service provider, because they've got loads of clients coming to them with something they've half digested from their compliance people who like to keep everything cloaked under the dark art, going, I don't know what this means, but you got to do it. Or I don't know what they mean by this, but you can't do it. So the OSPs will probably be the first people to understand what you can and can't do with AI. But I think at the moment there's a real tension, because most people accept or think or say we can't put a stop to it. Most of us don't understand what it is. And I think the regulators are really going to struggle to catch up. But it probably means that some of the people, as with GDPR, who are listening to this, are the people who are actually going to have to explain what they're doing or explain what's happening to that customer audience. And that's hard. And you can't give a lawyerly answer, because if I'm a bit wound up and a bit suspicious, don't talk to me like a lawyer. That's not what I want to hear. I want some of that empathy, concern, direct communication. That's a real big challenge.
It's a really interesting take, because you're absolutely right. You know, we're looking at the steering kind of that's been given from the government, from Ofcom, from a lot of these organisations, and one of the key core tenets of that is transparency. You have to be able to, in relatively plain English, describe what happens within your processes when it involves AI. And if you don't have the ability to do that, it does raise some eyebrows. That's a really great point. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our period of time that we can have this conversation. But what I would say before I let you go is that it's been a brilliant conversation with you today, Steve. Thank you ever so much for joining me, and hopefully speak to you again in the future soon.
Yeah, I hope so. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Cheers.